How do you build a high-performing culture? This is Culture Architects. Candid conversations with extraordinary leaders sharing their biggest successes, failures, and lessons learned on their culture journeys. Here's David J. Friedman.
Welcome back to part 2 of my conversation with Ann Melinger, CEO of Bink. Last time, Ann walked us through Bink's culture compass and why culture shows up most clearly under pressure. We also talked about modeling from the top, the manager's role, and why behavior language beats vague we statements. We begin this half by tackling clarity, what leaders must make unmistakable, and how distinguishing core values from permission to play or aspirational values keeps the work grounded in daily practice. I would say one of my favorite authors as well is Patrick Lencioni, and he is all about clarity. To your point, whatever you would call it, he has his own framework, which I think is a little confusing, as clear as he usually is. I think his values discussion is one of the places he falls short in bringing clarity. But his point is, whatever you want to call it, one of the most important functions of a leader and of a successful company is absolute clarity about those questions. Who are we? Where are we going? What are we trying to do? What matters to us? Like, the more clear you are, the better. And he would certainly support your thinking that, that clarity, is authored, it's reinforced constantly, it's reinforced through all of the systems and internal communications. It's right through it's just clarity, 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 clarity.
Absolutely.
When you have that clarity, you get somewhere.
And one of the things that I also love about Patrick Lencioni in his conversation on values is the differentiation between core values versus other types of values. I find
that confusing. So tell me more. Why
let's
you like
talk
that?
about it. I love that because I just think so many leaders, to your point, as we've been discussing, they feel we need to have values.
Yep.
They have a list in their head. It's a very long list. And they come into the exercise believing if I don't say it, if it's not included on that list, then people will think it's not important to me. And where his framework really helps people get clear is, but what is truly core to who you are? In particular, I love the differentiation of permission to play values. His definition are values that you have to have just to even walk in the door. They're so basic. They're not core to who we are, but they're like basic operations of honesty, integrity, and really, to me, those permission to play values can live in your code of conduct. They're not going to answer those big questions of like, truly, who are we, where are we going, and how are we getting there? They're a little more like, don't steal money from the company. Don't lie to clients. Those things are so basic that to me, they're not truly core values. I think we actually use his framework to spend time educating executives when we're doing values work with them on understanding the difference between core values, permission to play values, aspirational values, accidental values. I actually think that taking the time to educate around that can be very productive.
Interesting. And I guess maybe for me, because I focus so heavily on the behaviors, I don't mean this in a flippant way, but I don't really care what category you want to put them in. All I care about is these are the things that if we do these things, we're going to be successful and operate the way we want to operate. And so it is fascinating. When you were talking about your comment about defining purpose and thinking about the question, and I really like the question. So where would the world be if we weren't here? In that podcast I was listening to, it was between Brene Brown and one of my favorites, Adam Grant, who I really love. And they were talking about, thinking about what are the things that you value from a personal perspective, because she's also a big believer in personal values, which I don't disagree with. I think the question Adam Grant was asking, or between the two of them, they were talking about, I'm trying to remember exactly how they said this, but the essence of it was what would be missing in the world? If you didn't have this, I think the way he asked it was, if this were missing in your life, what would you be really upset if this was missing in your life? And that's an indication of something that's really important to you.
Absolutely.
And so it's another way of if you take something away,
Exactly.
That could help you to think differently about, well, what is, like if you ask me what's important to me, I don't know. Well, what if it was missing, you would be really upset if that was missing? Oh, okay, that helps me to think about it. So I think those are interesting questions to help just try to get clear in your own mind about that.
Definitely.
So talk about, so you've got your values and behaviors. I want to come back to that in a moment. Well, I want to come back after that. I'm going to ask you something about that. Then I want to go to your beliefs and what role beliefs play in that, and the importance or why you think they're important to articulate. And I don't have a point of view one way or another, but curious to hear yours. But back to the values and behaviors. What's interesting, so you made the comment that Brene Brown said only 10%. I said, I don't know, maybe it's 20 or 25%, have gone from their values to their behaviors and said, okay, well, what does that look like in real life? And almost always when I see companies do that, the way they do it is a way that sounds really logical, except it creates a problem that they don't think about until I explain it to them. So what they typically will do is say, all right, well, we value, I'm going to use integrity as an example, integrity, loyalty, respect, commitment, passion, whatever their things are. And then they take each one of those and say, well, okay, we do value that. We really do. But what does it look like to live that? And they try to articulate the behaviors that would help them sort of unpack that value into real life. And that sounds like a perfectly logical thing to do. But the thing that they miss by doing that is that doing that immediately introduces a limiter or a constraint to the thinking, because the only behaviors we would ever think of are the ones that connect to those values. But there might be other behaviors that don't necessarily connect to those that happen to be pretty important here. Or if we had to, might fit into 4 different values, or might be somewhere in between them, and we never think of them because we constricted or limited our thinking from the beginning.
Yes.
And it's really fascinating when people get tuned into, like, it just doesn't occur to you to think of that unless somebody points that out. But it's what most companies do. So in your framework, if somebody has started with values, how do we make sure that we haven't limited ourselves unnecessarily?
I think it's a great question, because I think on the one hand, you do want to limit yourself. Again, this goes back to my belief in language and words. And if you have 6 or 8 or 10 or 12 or 16 values, people cannot remember them or connect to them in any meaningful way. So to some extent, you do need to limit yourself. And that's why some of that work around getting to what is truly core is so important. But like you, David, we do often start without values and instead focus on those behaviors. One of the questions I love to ask is, I'll say, imagine you're on a flight, you're traveling for business, you're going from one meeting to another, someone sits down next to you and you strike up a conversation with them. And through hearing about them and their career and who they are, they're giving you the impression that you absolutely want to hire them. You want them to come and work for you. We've all met those people where you're just like, ooh, that's a real spark plug. I want them on my team. What are they saying? What are they indicating to you that is giving you that feeling? So a lot of times we will start with questions like that, or storytelling. You talk a lot about Ritz-Carlton in your book. We use Ritz-Carlton stories all the time in our workshops as well, of what are those examples, because we're human and we love stories. What are those stories and examples of people who, like I said earlier, just did something that you want to replicate across the organization? And very often it is starting with those behaviors, those actions, those qualities that you can then start to group together. Now, I still do believe I love a good paradigm, turns out. And so I like the idea of grouping them together. I think having that framework can really help people understand and connect. But we often start big and funnel down. And Brene Brown also does it that way. She'll give you a list of, here's 50 values, narrow it down to 20, and then you got to get it down to 2. And so I am a big believer in sort of start big and cut down.
You know, it's when we do our work with clients and creating their behaviors, which we call fundamentals, sometimes someone will ask me, is it important to group them in some way? And I sometimes say to them, if you would have asked me that question 20 years ago, I would have said yes. And I am a very organized thinker. So my brain immediately goes into categories and groups, and that's how my brain works. And I would have said, yes, that's very important to do. I would tell you that 95% of our clients do not have them in any categories, and it's totally fine. And I would not have thought that in advance because I like to have things grouped. When people ask me a question, my answer is usually, well, I guess it's three things. It's really this, or this. That's just how my brain works.
Yes.
And yet my experience has been, it's not as important as I would have thought it is. And I think if I think of like, well, why is that true? I think the reason is perhaps the methodology that I and we teach. That if we're going to take one at a time and we're going to cycle through them over and over and over and over and over again, whether you have 4 or 11 or 17 or 26 doesn't really matter. And whether they're in groups don't really matter because we're just going to go through them every week for the rest of our lives. If at Ritz-Carlton's original 20 basics, they weren't in any groups. Every day we're going to do one. And at the end of 20 days, we're going to do them again. And so why do I need them in any groups?
Right.
If you don't have a methodology like that, I think, then you need them groups because I don't know how to remember them. I don't know how to talk about them. You give me 15 things. I don't even know what you're talking about. But if you could break those into groups of 3 or 4 or 5, okay, I can work with that. So I think maybe it's the case, I'm just thinking about this out loud, that if we don't have a methodology for how we're going to practice them in a structured, repetitive way, it's really important to have groupings. If we do have a methodology where we're going to go through them and cycle through them over and over and over again in a repetitive way, then the groupings really serve no necessary purpose. I think I hadn't actually thought of it that way exactly why that is until just this moment.
Great.
But I think maybe that's the difference.
Yeah. And I think I would go maybe even a step further to say none of it matters if you're not measuring your people on it. And that is often when we do this work, what I say is truly the gold standard. Values, behaviors, it's all great. None of it matters if you're not pulling it all the way through to competencies, if you're not using it in terms of how you promote people, how you give people raises, how you compensate them. That to me is truly the most important thing. I'm with you. I love a framework. I love numbers. I love things in groups of 3. But at the end of the day, what really matters is, are you measuring and holding people accountable to practicing those behaviors in their job?
I would agree with that. And that comment highlights why our previous part of this conversation about clarity is so important. How could I measure? How could I hold people accountable if I don't have enough clarity about, well, what is it exactly that I'm holding them accountable to? And so that's why everything starts with that clarity. None of the other things, you can't pull it through the system if we didn't have clarity from the very beginning.
Absolutely.
So talk to me, let's go to this belief thing. So you've got in your structure, you've got values, we've got behaviors, we've got beliefs and then experiences. So tell me about what are beliefs in your view and what role does that play in this?
Beliefs to me, again, it goes back to sort of maybe what is traditionally thought of as mission and vision. It's the sort of who are we and why are we here? And a lot of times when you get into these conversations, I think the topic of generations tends to come up, right? The millennials and the Gen Zs care more about these things. I think everyone cares about these things. I think I actually just shared something today on social media about Peter Drucker, who made observations at General Motors in like the 40s about the fact that people were not simply there for a paycheck. This has been around for a very long time. So to me, it's when somebody is deciding to enter into an employment contract, meaning a contract in the sense that I'm going to give my skills, my talents to this organization to support its success. I need to understand what that's all about. What is that for? Where is that going? That's the beliefs to me.
And so where in the process, well, let me ask it this way first. Is it necessary to articulate those beliefs? And if so, where in that process does that happen for you?
I think that is one of the it is a foundation of culture. And if you don't have those things clearly defined, and if you don't have a leadership team that is aligned behind what it means and what it looks like, then it's useless. It's just wallpaper. Same with the values. Any organization can have those things on the walls, but if they're not showing up in the way your leadership is practicing, if they're not showing up in your strategy, in the decisions that you're making, if they're not showing up in your day-to-day experiences as an employee, then they're useless. So it's not so much a linear process as much as you have to have all of those things in order to have a strong, healthy culture.
And so experience is then taking the fourth piece of your paradigm. Is that just making sure that the day-to-day experiences I have as an employee in this company are in alignment with what we said we are really about here?
Exactly. And seeing every one of those moments and every one of those experiences as an opportunity to reinforce the culture, not simply by telling people what it is, although that is a part of it, storytelling, celebrating successes, things like that. That is very important, but also what is happening on day one in my onboarding and orientation? What's happening on my last day? How am I being treated when I am laid off or when I depart to go work for a competitor? How am I treated? How is my manager treating me in my one-on-ones? Do I have one-on-ones? How is my performance management being handled? You must audit every single one of those points in an employee's experience and really see it as an opportunity to either reinforce or erode your culture.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about your company. And I know that you're heavily focused in biosciences. So what led to that and why do you focus there?
It's a great question. We have always worked in the life sciences space, and I think it brings with it a couple of things that really speak to me. One being just the life-changing nature of the work. Everyone likes to feel like their work makes a difference, and I think in this case it really truly does. Kind of yes, there's a clear purpose. There's also a real diversity in employee type. You take a large global pharmaceutical company and you have pharmaceutical sales reps, which are quite an interesting audience of employees, contrasted with scientists who are working in a lab, contrasted with people who work in finance, people who work in is a very highly regulated industry. So the diversity of the employee audience has always appealed to me. And I think what is most interesting to me about this work too is the fact that there are so many companies that are in an earlier stage of development. And having worked with some of the long established pharmaceutical giants, I get really energized and excited working with some of these earlier stage companies because I think that's when you really have the opportunity to establish the culture that you want. When you work with the larger firms, making a change is really hard. It's a very piecemeal, slow process. Whereas when you're working with an earlier stage organization, you have an opportunity to do it right from the start. And that really energizes me.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. When you were talking before about making sure that the experiences that people have are consistent with what people talk about. And it's interesting, when I look at the many, many different companies that we've worked with, which are typically, I would call them small to medium-sized entrepreneurial companies. So you do have people, right, that can make decisions, that things can happen because it's not that huge a company. One of the most, I say, naive things that I hear from leaders, and I don't say naive in a pejorative kind of way, but naive nonetheless, is when they think that their example ought to be enough. That I set a good example and people ought to figure out what it is that's important around here. And I'm always reminding them that, setting a good example I was a philosophy major in college, and in philosophy, we used to talk about things that are necessary but not sufficient. So it is necessary to set a good example and to illustrate what it is that we want to be. But that's not enough. If you're not teaching people, just assuming that they're going to watch you and figure out all the stuff that we care about around here, that's not a likely prescription for success. And so it is
Absolutely.
important to do both. It is important to set that example and create those experiences, and also to articulate, well, this is why we do this, and this is why this is important, and to teach and teach and teach
Absolutely.
and teach. And I think a lot
Absolutely.
of people forget that.
And I think you describe that in the book as sort of the difference between a good culture and a world-class culture. And I think that's true. Just a good leader demonstrating great behaviors over and over, it's going to help.
Yeah,
It
it
will
will.
get you
That'll be a
somewhere.
good start.
Probably it will give you a good culture. Now, is it going to give you a world-class culture? Is it going to make you a differentiator? Not to mention, I really, as you were talking, David, was thinking about the concept of legacy as well.
Mhm.
CEOs are not in their seats forever. Even those of us who run our own business, we're not going to be doing it forever. We want our businesses to outlive us. And if you want that to be the case, then you do need to be thinking about, what is my legacy and how am I taking this culture that I have very intentionally built and designed and making sure that it does outlive me.
Yeah. Yeah. I see that in particular where that conversation comes up frequently. In particular, many of our clients end up, because they're small to medium-sized entrepreneurial companies, many of them are multi-generational family businesses, and legacy is really important there. This is
Absolutely.
third, fourth generation, and what's the legacy of this family? And
Yes.
typically, my experience is that typically those founders of those companies, or if it's now the CEO is second or third generation, he or she remembers their father or grandfather and what they stood for. And if you were to ask that father or grandfather or founder, typically, well, about culture, they say, culture, you don't need that stuff. You just take care of customers and everything will take care of
That's
itself.
right.
And
That's
I was,
right.
when I talk to those people, I try to remind them, we have to extract, grandpa-ness, the things that grandpa stood for. He maybe never articulated them, but if we want that legacy to carry on, we have to be able to articulate, well, what is that grandfather-ness, that thing that person
Yes.
stood for, and now articulate that so that we can teach it in a more purposeful and intentional way down the line, and we don't lose
Absolutely.
that.
I couldn't agree more, and it's such a great example. I'm actually working, one of my clients right now is a 93-year-old business. It
Mm-hmm.
has always been family owned, and
Mm-hmm.
for the first time in its history, it has a CEO that is not in the
Mm-hmm.
family. And this is a great challenge and a great moment of transition for this organization, and all the more reason why articulating,
Yes.
defining, documenting those things is so important, so that you can say, from when we pass the baton to this new leader, these
Yes.
parts of our legacy are not going away. And it is
Absolutely.
a part of who we are. It's part of our DNA now, even with new leaders coming in and able to adopt it.
Yeah, absolutely. So this has been a fascinating conversation. I hate to even end it, but as we bring this
Absolutely.
to a close, one question that I'm always curious about with everybody, and if you've listened to my other podcast, I always like to ask this. I'm always curious, when anybody's been doing something for some period of time, hopefully we get smarter, we learn things, we have things that we used to think were true, and now we realize, I was really naive about that. I'm always curious about the wisdom you've gained. There's some things that when you were first getting into this industry or this aspect of the industry, you thought were the case. And
Hmm.
now you think, oh, that was the naive Anne. And now I see this in a different way. What would
Hmm.
you, what's the biggest piece of wisdom? Or maybe I'll ask that another way, or if you can answer this in whichever way is most useful for you. But another way of framing that same question is, if you were talking to somebody who is just getting out of college now, and they're getting into this area, and you want to share with them something you've learned that you wish you knew when you were that age,
Hmm.
what's the biggest wisdom you would share?
It's a great question. And I think, especially in this moment, I'm impressed we made it all this time having this conversation and didn't bring up AI. But I think it's hard not to at least consider how much AI is changing, and in particular, how much it's changing the field of work that, internal communications and HR. And I think that what has always been most important to this work, and perhaps I didn't fully understand earlier in my career, is so nuanced, and it requires so much discussion, connection, human understanding. It is very human and emotional work. And you can have frameworks, we can have paradigms, we can have, all the processes in the world, which I know you and I both love. But at the end of the day, what it really comes down to is bravery, vulnerability. And those are things that you can't learn in a classroom. It can't be replicated by AI. And it is done through practice. It's done through active listening, and it's done through meaningful connection on a really human to human basis. And I think has never not been the case, and it will never not be the case. So I think that would be my biggest piece of advice.
Sounds very Brene Brownish.
I'm definitely a student of Saint Brene, as I like to call her.
I can hear that. I don't disagree at all, but I can hear that in your comments.
Yes.
What, to your point, one of my favorite things in the world as a writer and a language person, as you are, is crafting, a set of what we call fundamentals to get them just right. To get them to get that one word does mean something different or carries a different emphasis than a different word, and getting it just right so it says what you really want it to say. That's just fun to me too. But you're right, that part of it never really goes away.
Yeah.
Well, and this has been a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate you joining us on the podcast, and look forward to further collaborating with you.
Absolutely. It's been a lot of fun. Like I said, I'm a big fan, and I've really enjoyed the conversation and look forward to continuing as well.
That's great. And that wraps up today's episode of Culture Architects with Anne Melinger of Bink. If you're enjoying these conversations, subscribe on your favorite platform, and also consider leaving a quick review, and that way other culture-minded leaders can find the show. And for more tools on building a high-performing culture in your organization, visit CultureWise.com. See you next time on Culture Architects.
This has been Culture Architects with David J. Friedman. Join us next time for more insights and wisdom from great leaders in all walks of life. To book David for your next event, or to learn more about his writing, speaking, or consulting, go to davidjfriedman.com. Culture Architects with David J. Friedman is a production of CultureWise.